Thank you, and thanks for the invitation to present here this afternoon. Although I know the invitation was to the Auditor General, unfortunately he wasn't able to attend, so you'll have to make do with me for the purposes of this. As the President said, this final panel is considering communication with stakeholders and increasing the trust of citizens. And I thought it would be useful if I spoke a little bit about an exercise that we undertook to obtain the views of our stakeholders, and based on that to consider ways that we could improve our communication with them. Often our stakeholders, particularly the organisations that we are subject to examination, may not like what we are communicating, because that message can point out weaknesses in how they are operating, and sometimes this is communicated in a very public way. However, it is still important that we are clear in our communication, constructive in how we communicate what may be seen as a negative message. So what I hope to do today is just to give you a very brief overview of the main elements of the work of the Comptroller and Auditor General in Ireland. Obviously I won't go into that in any great depth because it'll be very similar to the work that each of you carry out in your organisations. But I just want to give you some context to the views that were expressed by our stakeholders in relation to the key outputs that we produce and how we communicate those outputs. I will then talk about what key stakeholders we consulted and how we went about obtaining their views. The main part of my presentation will set out some of the views that our stakeholders expressed. And it was interesting to listen as the day went on that a lot of what ye have raised as issues with communication were also felt by the stakeholders that we consulted with. And indeed they were things that we were already aware of and trying to improve on. Finally, I will just summarise some of the actions we have taken or intend to take to improve our communication in light of the views expressed. So what does our work involve, and what communications does that work lead to? This will be very familiar to all of you. Our overall aim is to improve the way public resources are used and to strengthen the accountability for the use of those resources. Our main outputs relate to the financial audits of a wide range of public sector bodies. As you can see, there are 290 of those audits. These audits lead to the provision to Parliament of an audit opinion on each set of financial statements. The audits also result in ongoing communication with the bodies that we audit, including some key documents such as management letters and reports to audit committees. We also produce an annual report setting out matters that were identified during our audits of central government departments. These may be matters that were identified during the particular year's audits, or they may be issues that we were concerned about and carried out a more in-depth examination of. Finally, we produce a number of special reports on how public resources are used. These relate mainly to examination of value for money issues, but they can also arise from general matters identified during our financial audits. What we are aiming to achieve with our work is to add value to the organisations that we audit by presenting recommendations that help not just with their individual performance, but also identify good practice and improvements that are applicable across the public service. Crucially, we're also aiming to support the process by which Parliament, through the Committee of Public Accounts, holds public bodies to account for the use of those public resources. So from that overview of what we do, it's fairly clear who our key stakeholders are and therefore who we need to consult. And in that regard, we're no different from the rest of the organisations here. Our main stakeholder is the citizen. However, other than our published reports, we generally do not have an ongoing communication with citizens. Our main communication in that regard is with the Committee of Public Accounts, who Parliament, which represents citizens, has assigned the responsibility of examining our reports. We can ensure the trust of citizens by presenting clear, balanced and evidence-based reports to Parliament on matters that can lead to improvements in how public resources are utilised. The bodies that we audit are also key stakeholders, and as well as the general staff within each body, those of particular interest are the leaders of those organisations, usually the accounting officer of a government department or the chief executive of a semi-state body, and in the case of semi-state bodies, the governing board, and in particular the audit committee, which each board appoints as a subcommittee. Obviously, I've put at the bottom of the slide there, our own staff are a key stakeholder. This particular stakeholder survey did not include them. We have other surveys and processes for obtaining feedback from our own staff. So to make the process of consulting with the stakeholders easier, we engaged consultants to do it on our behalf. This also helped in that it ensured the anonymity of the views of the stakeholders. So they didn't have to tell us to our face what they really thought of us. They could say it to a consultant, and they were ensured that it would remain anonymous. So the consultation involved formal interviews with the questions developed by the consultants with our input. So interviews were held with each accounting officer or chief executive of each selected organisation, as well as the chair of the organisation's audit committee. The sample of organisations to be interviewed was selected by the consultants, who tried to ensure it covered a variety of organisations in terms of type, size and sector. The spread of the organisations is shown on the slide. In addition to that, the consultants interviewed members of the Committee of Public Accounts to obtain their views, which, as we'll see later on, by and large mirrored the views of the stakeholders and brought up many of the issues that we have already discussed here today. As you can imagine, a lot of information was obtained through this process. So rather than providing us with a summary of everything that was said, the consultants tried to set it out by the themes that emerged. For the purposes of this presentation, I've categorised the main issues identified as shown on the slide. Independence, whether we were seen as being independent of government and of the bodies that we audit. Staffing, how stakeholders viewed the professionalism of our staff and how our staff approached their work. Financial audit and performance audit outputs, how useful they found our main outputs and how they felt they could be improved. And then what they value most from what we do. And finally, what they would like to see more of, or what they would like to see us doing differently. So in relation to independence, the comments were overall very positive, and some of the words used by the stakeholders are shown on the slide. The office was seen as being definitely independent, and was also seen as independent of the Committee of Public Accounts and of politicians generally. Just to show that not all of the comments were positive, you will see on the slide that one comment was that our staff could not be fully independent if they were auditing people that they meet every day in the canteen. So I think we are confident enough in our own ethical processes to be sure that this isn't a real problem that we face. Our stakeholders viewed our staff as showing a high level of professionalism and remarked on the quality of the work. They were very positive about our staff's familiarity with public sector systems, procedures and the culture and values of the public sector. Staff were seen as being very persistent and insistent. One issue that was identified as particularly important was the need for our staff to engage at the right level in the organisation so that they can obtain a full understanding of the area that they are auditing. Another matter that caused some concern was the need to ensure continuity when there are changes to the audit team. Some of the organisations consulted had experience of being audited by contract staff on our behalf. These would be both staff that we contracted in to make up for shortfalls on our own in-house teams, as well as cases where the full financial audit was contracted out to an external firm of auditors. There were a number of concerns expressed about this contracting, such as the outsourced staff's knowledge of the public sector and of government accounting rules. And this is something that we find as a continuing challenge to us, to make sure that contracted staff and contracted firms are fully briefed on the requirements of public sector audit. So in relation to our financial audit output, stakeholders expressed the view that they valued the expertise of the office in undertaking the financial audit work. However, some expressed the view that when we are examining propriety issues, we could perhaps reconsider the materiality levels used. In recent times, there's been a greater focus on propriety matters, not least by the Committee of Public Accounts, and there was little guidance in this area on what is appropriate and what is not. This perhaps has led to audited bodies feeling we are raising matters in these areas where the amount of expenditure is relatively small. Some expressed the view that audit was seen as a fault-finding exercise, and maybe that's just an inevitable part of the audit process. As I said earlier, the main outputs from our financial audits, in addition to the audit opinion to Parliament, are the management letter and the reports to audit committees. Some expressed the view that these were concise, which was seen as a positive, but that in the case of some issues raised, more detail was needed in order to fully explain the issue. In relation to our interaction with audit committees, many expressed the view that they would like to see more of our staff and have more interaction with us. Turning to our performance audit outputs, the consultants reported that there was a real appetite for more special reports, particularly in relation to value for money. And this was a view that was expressed not just by the stakeholders in the bodies that we audit, but also by the members of the Committee of Public Accounts. It was specifically mentioned that the value of such reports lay not just in the public accountability that they ensure, but also in the learning opportunities that they identify. Stakeholders also felt that more reports that examined cross-cutting themes where the findings could apply to a wide range of bodies would be very useful. And we've talked a lot already today about how our work can add value, and I think this is one of the ways that we can really add value. Just by way of background to those comments, I should mention that at the start of the economic downturn a number of years ago, and the resource constraints that we experienced in our office, just like the rest of the public service in Ireland and probably in much of Europe, the number of special reports we produced fell. This was because we needed to deploy our available resources as much as possible to our financial audits, which were required to be carried out every year. We did focus our remaining performance audit resources on smaller scale topics to ensure that there remained a body of work for the Committee of Public Accounts to examine. Since then, we've been trying to increase the number of special reports we produce. So this is probably what underpins the suggestion from stakeholders for more special reports. The main things that stakeholders said they value is probably evident from what I have just described, but when they were asked to summarise, they specifically mentioned the comfort that is provided by an audit or examination, the experience that our staff bring to that work, the quality of the work carried out, and the independence that we bring to the work. Despite the comment that I mentioned earlier in relation to a feeling that our work was a fault-finding exercise, in setting out what they value most from our work, a number of stakeholders mentioned the assurance that they get from systems and projects being examined and being given what they called a stamp of approval. There's a longer list, as you can see, of what they would like to see or what they would like to see more of. They would like to see more presentations and briefing events from us. Two events in particular that we hosted for audited bodies in recent years and which were very well received were mentioned. The first was a good practice event in relation to the work of audit committees that we hosted after we had published a special report that examined the effectiveness of audit committees. That report included a good practice guide to assist audit committees, and we followed it up with an event for audit committee members and chief executives of semi-state bodies. The other event occurred in the run-up to the introduction of FRS 102 as the accounting framework for the Irish public sector, and we hosted a briefing events for bodies that were affected by it. Both of these events were, as I said, very well received, and the stakeholder survey definitely gave the clear message that people would like to see more such events. Stakeholders said they would also like to see more guidance, particularly in relation to technical issues. Audit committee members mentioned that they would like more engagement with us. Some bodies felt that their audits could be completed on a more timely basis, and this is something that we have been working with bodies on. And in recent years we have published a report on the timeliness of public sector financial reporting and the issues that can arise which lead to delays. In relation to our reports, our performance audit reports, some stakeholders felt that we could make greater use of graphics and illustrations and move away from always having to describe things with long paragraphs of text. And again, this is something that we've talked about, that's already been talked about here today. The final thing that was mentioned was more follow-up work to provide assurance that issues identified had been addressed. Again, we have dealt with this during the course of the day. So finally, what do we plan to do to address some of the matters raised? Well, as I said earlier, a lot of the matters that were raised we had already started to try and address, but I suppose the views of our stakeholders focused our minds in that regard. We were clear that we couldn't address everything that was raised, and in some respects it may not be appropriate to do so. Nevertheless, we did set out a number of planned actions in our office plan up to 2020. We already had a plan, as I said, to increase the number of special reports, and our request for more resources to do so was granted. We are currently in the process of adding to our resources for performance audit work. However, we are facing the problem that a lot of organisations in Ireland are at the moment, and that is recruiting suitable professional staff, and just as importantly, retaining them after you've recruited them and trained them. We've committed to continue to work with bodies to achieve more timely completion of audits. For a number of years now, we have targeted the larger bodies for early completion, and this has been by and large effective. There are still a number that require attention, and we are working with some of the smaller bodies to bring forward their audits. Where delays are caused by, on the part of the bodies, the report that I mentioned on reporting in timely reporting in the public sector is focusing their mind on the need to cooperate with us in finalising audits. We committed to look at our propriety audit programme and tailor it, if necessary, to ensure it is balanced and appropriate. We are trying to improve our engagement with audit committees and are redesigning the template reports that we present to them. Already we have redesigned the planning report and it has been favourably received. Audit committees want to see more of our audit teams, but with 290 bodies this presents a challenge in terms of the time and resources that involves. Some, because of their size, we already meet a number of times a year. Others we can only get to once a year at most, and often it's by way of a telephone conference. We have for a number of years been trying to increase the readability of our reports and make greater use of graphics and illustrations. It is something we emphasise to teams right from the start of performance audits, to try and get them to think about how the information can be presented in the clearest way possible right from the start of the examination. In addition, we are currently redesigning our website to make it more accessible. We have also committed to hold more good practice events. While there is a big resource commitment in holding large-scale events such as the ones I mentioned earlier, we have already identified a number of opportunities where we can present at smaller scale sectoral forums on issues such as the role of internal audit and governance matters. Finally, we had already begun a process of formally following up on recommendations from our performance audit reports, and we will continue to do that and report on the results. So thank you for your attention.